Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Good day, everyone, and welcome to another live streaming for our third session of our evolution course. Is evolution true or false? And session 3 was about LUCA, and we called it LUCA's paradox. And the reason we call it LUCA's paradox is that we explained what LUCA is. And LUCA is the last universal common ancestor, which doesn't mean that it is the first life that occurred. The theory claims that there was life before LUCA, simpler and simpler life. We start from a protocell, which is the result of abiogenesis, and then there is a hypothesis that there was RNA-based life, and then we have LUCA. And then we explained those paradoxes. So I have today with me your questions, and we'll go through them one by one. So we have first, I have some comments on the paradoxes themselves. I have some of you had questions about the paradoxes. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to show on the screen each paradox, and I'm going to show the question about it, and then I'm going to give an answer. So here we go. Okay, so the first question is about paradox 1. It says, your claim is RNA doesn't have error correction mechanism, so how did it survive into making thousands of species that do have error correction mechanism? And are you still surviving? Okay. So no, this is not my issue. My issue is, how did LUCA itself survive? So we explained in the video that RNA is quite vulnerable to mutations because it doesn't have error correction. So if LUCA was an RNA-based life form, how did it in the first place survive to produce this whole tree that branched out of it? This is the question. So what we're doing here in the paradoxes is that we are taking the very possible scenarios, every possible scenario for LUCA, starting from RNA, and we see if we can reach a coherent answer. If you cannot reach a coherent answer, if you reach a paradox, then it means that this scenario is not possible because it's incoherent. So the first scenario was if LUCA is a RNA without error correction, so then we know Bluetooth. That it will degrade, and
Bluetooth connected.
Hence, it is not a viable scenario. This was the contention. Okay. His second comment, we have here another question. It was about the second paradox. It says, your claim is, if LUCA was RNA, then how did it replicate itself? Because it needs a host with DNA, but there were no DNA organism around it. Am I right? No, this was not my contention. So LUCA was not. Saying that LUCA was based on RNA is not like saying that LUCA was a virus. No, LUCA was a living cell. This is the claim of the theory, okay? So the contention here, my answer here is that if LUCA was a cell that is based on RNA and is living an independent life, it's like the other cells that we see today, like bacteria lives an independent life, etc. Living an independent life means it has its metabolism, it has its organelles, it has its reproduction, it can replicate itself, okay? So if this was the case, if there were living cells that were based on RNA, and those were at the very lower part of the trunk of life, and LUCA was one of them, then how come today the only form of an organism based on RNA that we have is a virus, And a virus is not considered living in the first place. And why it's not considered living? Because it doesn't metabolize and it does not have its own ability to replicate itself. It needs to hijack the machinery of a living cell to do that. So this is again a paradox. Just claiming that LUCA was an RNA-based, independent, living life form is contradictory to our observation today. And even if somebody would come and say, okay, LUCA was DNA-based, then my question to him is, what came before LUCA is thought to be RNA-based life. Cells that were also based on RNA. They were older than LUCA, because the claim is that there was life older than LUCA. Then how did those RNA-based cells have independent life, and we have nothing like them today? The only life form that we have today that is RNA based is viruses, is RNA viruses, and they are not considered living. So this is a paradox. If there was something like an RNA-based life, we should see it today. It remains an unsupported claim. I have another question for paradoxes 3 and 4. He says, your claim is, if LUCA evolved into creating its own error correction mechanism and then passed this function on its branched DNA organisms, but why did viruses not inherit this error correction mechanism? So he's saying, he's reading my paradoxes as I am saying that LUCA, as we said in the episode, some theorize that LUCA had some RNA-based error correction so that it can preserve its genetic material. And he's saying that if it passed that to its branched DNA organisms, why didn't virus inherit it? Yes, this was one of my contentions. He says that evolutionists can give this response. He says that evolutionists can go like this. They may say that LUCA never evolved an error correction mechanism, but later down the line, one of the DNA organisms began creating a basic error correction mechanism, which eventually evolved into a master error correction mechanism. And he's asking about my thoughts. So I have two answers here. So we had actually two distinct paradoxes that he put together into one. So the first thing is, if LUCA didn't have the error correction mechanism, then it wouldn't survive in the first place. So we go back to the previous paradox. And if it had RNA with error correction, okay, which is my third paradox, then how come other RNA-based life forms that have error correction did not survive until today? Why did they perish? Why do we only have, at the end of the day, DNA-based life? Because the advantage in DNA versus RNA is that DNA-based life has error correction, while RNA-based life does not have. So DNA has an advantage. But if LUCA had this error correcting advantage, then we should see today living things that have RNA as their basis of life, and they are surviving. But we don't. Then it means that LUCA did not have an error correction mechanism. Otherwise, this life should have been extant. Now, if it didn't have, then how did it survive itself? So this was my third paradox. My fourth paradox, I'm saying that if DNA, now, if by any means, there was RNA-based life and then it branched miraculously, DNA-based life came into being. When you discuss with evolutionists, they will always tell you this, that, for example, you tell them, how come there are still apes? If apes evolved into humans, they would tell you, well, these are two different topics. Okay, because apes evolving into humans does not mean that apes will go extinct. So the same argument I'm putting here. If LUCA evolved, it branched into one branch that has DNA as its basis, it should branch into another branch that has RNA into its basis. but we don't see the other branch. So it's a paradox again. And the paradox is coming from the fact that every single sort of life that we see around us today, that we consider life, that is metabolizing, that is replicating, is DNA based. So if life in its origin was RNA based and then RNA branched into DNA, where is the second branch? Where is the remaining RNA based life? Where did that go? I have a comment about paradox number 5. He says, which came first, which is about which came first, enzymes or DNA. He says, can they not co-create an enzyme and DNA, or this is wishful thinking? Of course, it's wishful thinking, but according, even as you say, he says that evolutionists might say that the co-created, they co-created simultaneously over millions of random attempts, and then one day an enzyme and a DNA popped up. Yeah, this is what they say, that they co-existed, but it's not about saying. So my answer is, evolutionists always invoke gradualism. So nothing pops up in the theory of evolution, because random mutations and natural selection cannot do much in a jump, and for sure not create an integrated system. So if they say it happened gradually, please show me. And if it happened gradually, where are also the remnants of the stages that it went through? We only see today DNA that has the good mechanisms included with it. So where is the rest of it? Okay, there is another comment. It's about paradox number 6, and he says, you claim if RNA evolved into a DNA organism which did not have error correction mechanism at first, then how did it survive? Yes, this is what I am saying. I'm saying that if we had RNA without error correction, this is what RNA does, and then somehow we evolved, LUCA evolved into DNA without error correction, and then later error correction came into place, then the question is, how did this first DNA-based life, like prokaryotes, like bacteria, for example, or archaea, how did it survive? Because without error correction, DNA suffers huge damage, as we said in the video. Every day, every cell suffers tens of thousands, up to 1 million damages in its DNA. And this is fixed. It's because of external environment and just normal metabolic activity within the cell. It just hurts the DNA. So he says, evolutionists can reply to this, that there were DNA organisms that did not die, and then through zillions of cycles, one day this error correcting mechanism magically popped up. Okay, so somebody's telling me, your mind is telling me that it's okay, the video is okay now. Okay, that magically popped up through numerous randomizations in the DNA. If they did die, then millions of cycles does not apply. If you start from RNA-based organisms that does not have error correction, and then you have DNA organism that does not also have error correction, then this DNA-based organism will not stay around for long. The mutations will be so vigorous, it will destroy it. So it will not have this chance for gradual anything. Anything that happens will be destroyed by the mutations. So it's a paradox again. So this is my answer. We know from today's observations that DNA suffer huge damage daily. That's why there is only DNA with error correction mechanisms. If there weren't, how did it survive long enough to have time to mutate gradually, because again, mutation, natural selection works very gradually. And beneficial mutations are very, very rare, very extremely rare. So for you to bump into one of them, you need millions of years. If this thing has harmful damage, loads of them every single day, even if you are lucky to get one beneficial mutation, you're dead or before you reach it. So, okay. And then comment number 7, on paradox number 7, he says, your claim, where are DNA organisms with no error correction mechanism today if evolutionists say that there were DNA organisms in the early days with no error correction mechanisms? Yes, this is my contention. If you go like this, if you go RNA without error correction, then DNA without error correction, then DNA with error correction, then it means that DNA with error correction is a clad of DNA without. Where is the second branch? Because if DNA without error correction, which we never experienced, was stable enough to survive, then evolving DNA with error correction should not cause it to go extinct. Again, exactly like their claim that if humans have evolved from apes, it does not mean that apes disappear. There is another branch that remains looking like an ape, even if there is a branch that looks like a human. So if there is DNA without error correction and it goes to the direction of DNA with error correction, magically, there is no way I can think that this is possible. But if it is possible, just for the sake of the argument, then where is the other branch that remains without error correction? If it was stable enough to take millions of years to evolve in this direction, it should not go extinct. It should remain. A part of it evolves and the rest remains. So he says that evolutionists might say because they had no error correction mechanisms, they all died, and therefore we only have DNA with error correction mechanisms. And then if they say that, my answer will be, I will be glad that they say that. Because if they say that the DNA without error correction died away because it didn't have error correction, then how come it had millions of years where it did not die already, so that the error correction mechanism will evolve? They will be contradicting themselves. If they said it evolved, it means it needed to live for millions of years. If it can live for millions of years, don't tell me it died away because it didn't have error correction. You're contradicting yourself. Okay, and then we have, so these were the comments about the paradoxes, and those were my answers. And then we have questions. So the first question says, does RNA have zero error correction abilities compared to the resilient DNA error correction mechanism? The answer is RNA has a type of error correction when it is inside of the cell, when it is inside a DNA-based cell. So there is something called quality control, for example, in cells that are run by DNA. So you have the DNA, it is transcribed into RNA, and while RNA is translated, sometimes, for example, the produced protein is not correct. So some mechanisms will destroy this produced protein. Sometimes the RNA strand is sort of stuck with the ribosome that is translating it. And then there are mechanisms that will degrade this mRNA. It will remove it away. Somebody might argue that degrading the protein and degrading the mRNA is not an error correction. Yes, it is just preventing the translation process from producing poisonous proteins. Some speculate that since this is not the best use of energy to produce a protein and then destroy it, that maybe DNA-based cells can even fix an mRNA strand that has a defect. Okay? Some speculate that. So if this speculation is correct, then maybe there are RNA correction mechanisms. But we look at the facts in front of us. When we have an RNA-based life form, quasi-life form, like a virus, and it goes into the cell, and now its RNA material is being replicated by the cellular machinery, we have said in the session, and I've provided references, that the mutation rate of the virus can go up to 1 million times compared to the mutation rate of its host cell. So it means that this is why viruses, keep mutating all the time, and after some time, after interacting too much with their host, they will attenuate. Okay, of course, viruses fix that because they have huge numbers, but it remains the fact that if this was a normal cell that is not producing by the millions and the trillions like viruses do, probably an RNA-based life without error correction would not sustain itself. The second question is, what's the building block for DNA and RNA? I hear protein and amino acids. Is this correct? No, it's not correct. DNA and RNA are the building blocks are called nucleotides, which are nitrogenous bases. And those bases are arranged on a backbone. And the backbone is sugar. Ribose in the case of RNA, and deoxyribose in the case of DNA, and there's phosphate groups binding them. The difference between DNA and RNA is in the nucleotides, in the bases. So DNA has AGCT and RNA has AGC also, but the T is uracil. And then those bases are later in the translation process, the RNA is translated into each 3 bases will correspond to an amino acid, for example. So 61 codons will give 20 amino acids. You have 3 stop signals. We have 20 amino acids, and those amino acids will get arranged into what's called a peptide chain, which then forms a protein. So this is the relation. So you have bases, the AGCT gets transcribed into AGCU, which is the letters of RNA. Each 3 form a codon. Each codon corresponds to an amino acid. You arrange amino acids together in what's called a peptide chain. You fold this chain, you get out with a 3D shaped protein that has a certain function. So it's DNA, RNA, amino acids, put them in peptide chain, they become folded, it becomes a protein. This is how it goes. So question 3 is, what gave RNA life? Where did it come from, and how did it form itself? He's asking about the RNA world hypothesis. Well, you're asking as if I accept abiogenesis. I do not accept abiogenesis to have happened in a random manner and that life is purely a materialistic process. So I didn't accept it. And there is no answer from the abiogenesis is a host of a collection of hypotheses that this happened and this happened and that happened and this happened, and ridiculously low probabilities and events that cannot simultaneously happen fairly. They cannot be seen as simultaneously happening together. But the proponents of abiogenesis just consider that the impossible will happen. If it has the slightest, teeniest, weeniest possibility, it will happen. Sometimes when things become absurdly with low probability, it is absurd to consider that it is possible that they happen. And then if they happen, it will not be over and over again. This lucky thing happened, and then the next lucky thing should happen. Number one, why would the first lucky thing wait around until the second lucky thing happens? And expecting that you will get ridiculously low possibilities to occur one after the other is just absurd. But this course is not about abiogenesis, it's about evolution. But I accept what you said. It is ridiculous to consider that abiogenesis is true. Question 4, he says, are there any attempts by evolutionists in trying to answer any of the 7 paradoxes other than saying we don't know, but we have faith that we will know in the future? Have you read or heard any? My answer is there are proposals. They propose. Even some have spoken against the RNA world hypothesis altogether, and they say that maybe it was RNA plus peptides. Some say no, it was lipids. And every hypothesis is not a complete one. I'm glad that an evolutionary biologist will come and challenge me and tell me how LUCA has a chance to produce life as we know it. If LUCA existed, I have considered every possibility, and I have shown in the paradoxes that none of them is coherent with observation. If it was RNA without error correction, it would die away. If it was RNA with error correction, where is its extant clads? If it started as DNA without error correction, then it should go away. If it had DNA with error correction as a second evolution to DNA without, then where is the extant clad of the DNA without error correction, etc. So we have looked into every possibility, and none of them is coherent. I'm glad for somebody to come along and tell me how is this very first step of evolution in this theory makes any sense, makes any coherence between theory and observation and reality, because it doesn't. And if you have gone through the course webpage, there is article number 3, just after session number 3, and article number 3 has plenty of references to literature that I've put there. So you can see how some of those issues are being addressed, and they're addressed with "we don't know yet." My answer to this is proposals, and each will fall down into a paradox. So the typical answer would be, we don't have a sure answer yet, one day we will. And I say, okay, but then don't say you have a theory with a capital T. We have a theory of evolution, capital T. And it explains that we have no problem to understand the origin of species. No, you have in every single step. And this course will deconstruct the theory at every single step, LUCA forward. Because at every single step, you have paradoxes, unfortunately. Question number 5, he says, what's the oldest extant organism that lives until today? And how far are these from the branch of LUCA? If they're very near, then how come we can find them but not LUCA? Did LUCA stop replicating after evolving them? It's a good question. So supposedly after LUCA, we have unicellular organisms like bacteria and archaea, prokaryotes, and those prokaryotes are simple unicellular organisms with simple or DNA that is enough for them to perform the function. And prokaryotes have been around for billions of years. So your question, your concern is a good concern. Why don't we have LUCA around? If it was so good to be the root of life, why did everything, why did prokaryotes, for example, remain and LUCA went away? Okay. Now, question number 6. Can we not assume, like some scientists, that LUCA was pre-programmed with all the DNA needed for all creatures and then sent by the creator to morph itself into many creatures and begin life? This is called front-loading. that evolution is, maybe it happened the other way around. Maybe God created the first cell, the first LUCA, and this cell had every program that every creature needed, and it just kept branching, and the programs that were needed by each creature were maintained by that creature. So this is called front-loading. Would you like to assume it? Okay, you can assume what you want. The trick is to find evidence for it. So the evidence seems to be not for it, but who knows? We cannot know a historical event. You cannot know about a historical event for sure. Because the way they think about LUCA, so there is research, and through the research you're trying to find the genetic fingerprint of LUCA. You're trying to find the minimum possible genetic content that sustains life. And if you find that it looks the same with all organisms around, then it means that this genetic material, in the thinking of evolutionary theory, this genetic material is the fingerprint of LUCA. Now, how much DNA is needed for life? Well, some have said we can find this set of genes that like 300, I don't remember, 35 or 355. And those are LUCA, but then others objected that these are so few, they cannot sustain life. They cannot build the ribosome. And then others have said, okay, the problem is with lateral gene transfer, because the creatures after LUCA just kept exchanging their genes together. This is how it's theorized. And it's not like a vertically branching tree. There is this meshing happening. And hence, LUCA is obscured. So, okay, there are excuses. Question number 7, can we not question who or what created the conditions for LUCA to form in the first place, and the probability, can we not do it again, form life from a basic chemical into human? Well, LUCA was not the first life, so you cannot ask the question this way. You can ask about how the conditions for forming the first life came into being. So just correct the question a little bit. Yes, you can ask the question. They will not answer you anyway. And they're changing. So sometimes it came down on asteroids. Sometimes it's in hydrothermal vents in the bottom of the ocean. Sometimes it's just in the ocean. Sometimes it's a strike of lightning. Sometimes it's recently it's puddles of shallow ponds, drying up and getting wet again, and drying and getting wet again with tide, and then chemistry becomes organic chemistry that polymerizes and autocatalyzes itself, etc. And then if you say that the theories or the hypotheses are not complete, they will tell you this is how science works. Science starts incomplete and becomes complete with time. So you cannot complain that it is incomplete. This is just how science works. You should accept science the way it works. And when you consider that this means that they have no theory, they will just tell you, okay, you're invoking God of the gaps or whatever. So your question is fair. The problem is not having a good theory or having a good theory. The problem is that the scientific community does not have a good theory, but the science media or the science journalism pretends to the lay public that there is a good theory. This is the problem. This is the problem. Another question. Some say that there is no tree of life and rather a bush of life occurring from LUCA. Therefore, its evolution is random and doesn't have an end goal and can change in any direction. Thoughts? Yeah, this is what we have just been talking about now. But it's not a big issue here. Okay, so they're invoking this lateral gene transfer thing. Okay, the lateral gene transfer, yes, obscures LUCA, but it's not an excuse. So if we need an explanation for how we can move from RNA that has no error correction to RNA with error correction, or to DNA without error correction, and then DNA with error correction, we need an answer to this. It doesn't make a difference if genes are being exchanged or not. It's irrelevant. And lateral gene transfer is typically in the context of prokaryotes, for example, which already are DNA based and already have error correction, etc. We need to first find out how we move from an RNA organism that does not have error correction to a robust DNA based organism with robust error correction that maintains life, that prevents it from mutating into oblivion. No good answer to this. And still the theory insists that there is common ancestor. So another question, indirectly related to some kind of LUCA. Do you understand how we know that all primates share a hypothetical common ancestor? Why it's not literally one specific individual animal? Yeah. So thank you for invoking this. Hypothetical common ancestor. So there is this hypothetical thing. When you look at phylogenetic trees, you find these are two branches, and then they would gather, and then you have a node, and then you go back, and then there is another node formed from two other branches, and you keep going back. And many nodes of those are not real animals. They are hypothetical animals. Because you say that if this set of genes or set of features or genotype or traits are with this creature, and this is the comparative one for that other creature, it seems that this can happen if they go back to a node. But maybe this node existed or it didn't exist. And hence, I think that he is here implying that LUCA is constructed this way. But I'm sorry, the mainstream of evolutionary theory asserts that LUCA did exist as a specific species, not as a hypothetical creature. Okay? So you need to have a discussion with the evolutionary community before having this discussion with me. And if LUCA was a hypothetical creature, it didn't exist, what does that solve in the context of what we're discussing? I have also received some questions that are marked as out of off topic, but actually they are not so off topic, so I'm going to say them and answer them fast. So he says, you said that we are linked to plants through ancestral relation. If so, why don't we photosynthesize anymore? So yes, I didn't say, the theory says. So the theory says, since animals and plants are both eukaryotes, then you have animals, you have plants, and there is, they meet at a node where it's eukarya. And why don't we photosynthesize? Because photosynthesis happened to plants and did not happen to animals. So there was a branching, and this branch went into having photosynthetic abilities. The other one didn't have, because we did not evolve from plants. Both, according to the theory, both animals and plants had a common ancestor. Okay. But it doesn't make sense to me, but this is what the theory says, and this is another discussion. So you have the endosymbiosis line of thought, where a bacterium eats another one, and that other one becomes, for example, mitochondria. And in another event, a bacterium eats another bacteria, which is a cyanobacteria, and cyanobacteria after some time becomes a chloroplast. And this line goes to becoming plants maybe, and that line goes to becoming animals. I don't buy it, but this is what the theory says. But it doesn't say that animals evolved into plants, just that they have common ancestry. Because there are common factors between them. Those common factors imply to the evolutionary thinking. Okay, the common factors imply to the evolutionary theory that things are coming from a common living organism. That's a common ancestor. So you might think of it in a different way. Okay. So if, for example, you have a phone that's like the landline and a phone which is like the mobile phone, and both of them share features and programs that give them the ability, for example, to pick up your voice and convert it into an electric signal, in evolutionary thinking, this will mean they go back to a common ancestor. In rational thinking, this is just a classification. Doesn't mean that there was an ancestor that branched one way into a landline phone and in another way into a cellular phone. It doesn't have to be this way. This is how the theory thinks. And when you ask them why, they said that they will say that machines are different than biological beings. Biological beings reproduce and they change while reproducing, and then they will start talking about the mutations and the natural selection. Again, it's a worldview. It's a worldview rather than, and the worldview is really impacting how the theoretical thinking goes. Genetic mutation seems to be the hero in evolutionism. So are disabled people a product of genetic mutations? This is a question. Can we not see the genetic mutation does not lead to strength but weakness? Yes, you can, but they can't. Yes, mutations cause disease and destruction of function most of the time. This is what it does. And many sometimes if you lose a function, it can cause a feature that is good in a certain environment. Sometimes this happens, but it's circumstantial. And it's absurd to consider that continuous loss of function will cause continuous evolution, because then it means you had more genetic material at the beginning. You go back to the front-loading thing that they do not agree to. So again, the theory is full of paradoxes. Question 12 says, software cannot evolve randomly, but people say that softwares are not living organisms, whereas we are and function differently. What would you say about this? I say that they say this because they do not appreciate the great similarities between DNA and RNA and the mechanisms that they work with versus computer code in a hard disk, computer code in memory, and a computer running it. There is really great similarity. And yes, you cannot produce a software program from a precursor program by random mutation, and you cannot also produce novelty using their Darwinian mechanisms. And the reason is that they do not want to see this is that they just turn their back to genetic code being much like software. It is much more advanced than software, I have to say. Question 13, he says, I've heard people say that anything is possible over millions and millions of years. Then, is it not possible that the fossils they found just happened to be formed like that over millions of years? So he's trying to sell them back their own goods, yeah? No, the fossils found cannot have been shaped this way, like, for example, by erosion or by natural reasons. No. It's not reasonable to say that. Even if they say unreasonable things, people who are reasonable will not say that fossils that look exactly like skeletons, etc., of creatures that lived have been formed by natural reasons like erosion, etc. Because it's not reasonable to say that. The point is that the very basic premise that you are putting here is not correct. The statement that says anything is possible over millions and millions of years is not correct. It's false. anything is possible over infinite time. And infinite time is an amount of time where no matter how big an amount of time you can think of, if you put one and put a zillion zeros in front of them and then you write centuries at the end, this is something that you can think of. And infinity will make anything that you can think of very small, negligible. This is what infinity is. Okay? So if you are looking at finite time, then it is not true that anything that is possible will happen. It is not true. It is false to say that. For things to happen in finite time, they have to be reasonably possible. And you have to find a mechanism that can reasonably complete the process in reasonable time. For me, some things that are possible cannot even happen in infinite time. If I tell you that this place was infinitely there, can you expect to find a car that has happened through erosion and earthquakes and wind and landslides and hurricanes and volcanoes have a car? Doesn't make sense. So even if you are talking about infinite time, not anything that is possible can happen. It's not true. But for sure not for finite time. So the answer is no, everything is not possible over millions and millions of years, because any amount of time is not infinite. So only reasonable things can occur in finite time. I would say that also only reasonable things can occur in infinite time. Except that some reasonable things are more likely to have a better chance to occur if you give it infinite time. If they're reasonable, they will happen. Some reasonable things cannot happen in finite time because their probability is low, for example. But when things are absurd, they will not happen in finite time, and probably they will not happen in infinite time too. Okay, another final question. In this video, he mentions one video, and he says, you mentioned over millions of cards being thrown up into the air for over millions and millions of years, and then suddenly these cards start forming a triangle. Yes, I was giving this example, one of my videos, about playing cards in the air, and then they come down into the form of a house of cards. And I was showing that it's imaginable that this happens, but it is ridiculous if it happens, okay? And then the trick is, okay, maybe if we throw millions and billions and trillions of cards for a very long time, it will happen. That this card and that card go like this, and the other two like this, and then one goes like this, and then two go like this, and you have a pyramid. But if it happens once for any absurd probability taking place, you cannot expect it to happen so many times to the extent that, for example, you get out with life from non-life, or you get out with fish from unicellular organisms, gradually forming colonies and then becoming a multicellular organism, and then with time continue evolution. Some things are really too absurd. It cannot happen, even if you give it more time. So those were the questions that I got about the third session. Do we have any questions or comments from audience on the live chat? So I don't see further questions. If we don't see further questions for another minute, I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that we have a new website for the course that has the session, supporting material, articles that I write about the topic with plenty of references, and then there are quizzes. So what I would like you to do is to go to the quizzes and solve them. And if you have difficulty solving them, the model answers are there, and then you can ask more questions. And finally, I would like to hope everybody blessed Eid al-Adha, and to have great time with your family and friends. And thank you for being here on the live stream or watching it later. And see you again soon after we issue session 4. And this concludes this live stream for the questions about session number 3. Bye. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.